Muy buenas, un gusto estar una vez más en estas largas conversaciones que solemos tener hace ya un par de años en el contexto de Playdoc. Son las conversaciones que se mantienen online. En el festival a veces hay también encuentros, entrevistas, debates, más allá de que el centro obviamente es la programación. Pero en el tiempo en el que vivimos, la impresión que yo tengo, que tiene mucho que ver con estas conversaciones, el cine necesita de la palabra. La palabra es parte del cine y no me refiero a la palabra que se dice en una película, que se inscribe en un texto como texto en una película, sino el acto de escribir sobre cine como también de hablar de películas. Y para eso, empezar este conjunto de diálogos con Dennis Lim, no solo para mí resulta un placer inmenso, un privilegio para mi intelecto, un privilegio para mi corazón, porque creo que Denis es uno de los grandes críticos de cine, programadores o directores artísticos de festivales, sino porque también además es uno de los más extraordinarios conversadores que yo he visto, en todo caso, entrevistadores. Es parte, me parece a mí, de lo que él tiene un don de cómo hacer hablar a los que están allí para hablar de sus películas o a veces también de sus libros. Hay una extraordinaria conversación de Dennis con Jim Hoberman, que la recomiendo, está online, la pueden ver, y que ahí se ve un poco la inteligencia, la naturaleza inteligente del Lim como crítico y como programador. Muy brevemente voy a decir, Dennis en la actualidad es el director artístico del New York Film Festival, da clases en distintos lugares del mundo, entre otros lugares en España, estuvo ahí en Elías Querejeta Cine Escola, ha estado dando clases en Harvard University, en New York University, en Columbia, en New York University, donde según entiendo todavía sigue ahí dando clases. Eh, ha sido por mucho tiempo, ha escrito en Film Comment, ha escrito en Village Voice, ha escrito en New York Times, ha escrito en la revista que ya no existe lamentablemente, que es CinemaScope. Y además, entre todas esas cosas que hace, tiene la gentileza de tener tiempo para nosotros y hablar. Así que, let's begin, vamos a cambiar en inglés, esta ha sido una introducción en español, y de aquí en más vamos a esta lengua que es el inglés. So, very welcome, my dear Dennis. More or less, I was trying to say it about you as a writer, as a programmer. Something that I didn't say, I kept that for this because it would be part of our topics, maybe in the second part of our conversation, if the conversation flows. It's about to be Taste of Cinema, which is the book that you have written on Sang-soo. And before that, you have written another book, which is maybe is much more known, which is the book that you wrote on David Lynch, which is the Man from Another Place. Also, by the way, you have done a fantastic job. You did you worked like an editor in the 50 years or something like that. Was the call of the book on the Village Boys, as a corpus of writers which enhance the understanding of cinema in the Anglo-Saxon world, but particularly in the United States. I was a daily reader for more than 20 years of the Village Boys, when Village Boys used to weekly have the reviews and interviews and so on. I used to read you there. Of course, there are some other people like the one I mentioned in Spanish, Mr. Hoverman. So let's begin with programming, maybe. That's the starting point. You are working in New York Film Festival, which is, first of all, a festival which doesn't have a competition. We change the perception of what does it mean to select films and propose a proposition, by the way, about what cinema is. So let's begin with this simple question. What do you think film festivals which do not have competition can do? What kind of twist or what kind of exercising is behind when you don't have to think in competitions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good, very precise question. But first of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I thank you for the kind words. We don't often get the opportunity for self-reflection with the work that we do. So I'm really grateful to be doing it, especially with you. So thank you. Um, I think this question of, what a festival has and doesn't have is really crucial to its identity. I think New York doesn't have a competition, but I think there are also a few other things it doesn't have. It doesn't have a market attached to it, and it doesn't have red carpets every night. We have a red carpet like, at the opening and the closing for a few other films, but it's not a festival where there must be a procession up the carpet every film every day. So I think the fact that we don't have these things can be seen, I think, in some contexts as liabilities, but I think in some contexts they are also, you know, positives. They're also, I think, liberating. And I should also say that this was the identity of the festival when it was founded, 62 years ago by Amos Vogel and Richard Roud. The idea was that it would be a festival that takes the measure of the year in cinema. It presents films that are new to the New York audience. It introduces filmmakers to an audience in New York. But I think what that meant in 1963 is different from what it means today. I think that job involves different things. The landscape is different. The audience is different. Films are different. But I think that core idea of that I like the word that you use, the idea of a proposition. I think that is the task of putting that lineup together. Um, I think of it as making, just I think every program really for any festival is a statement, and I think this is about maybe more than that. I think making a case. I think this question of like I like to just think about, if somebody's asking me to make the case that cinema as an art form is important, is vital, is still something that, I think speaks to us, speaks to the world today, which films do I put forward as evidence? So I think that this lineup is an answer to that question of like, what how does cinema matter today? And I think that isn't always like my favorite films necessarily. Often it is, but it's just about this trying to respond to this question of like of making a case that cinema remains, despite all kinds of threats to its existence, despite all kinds of, I would, negative forces, I think, that are affecting cinema festivals, the world, that cinema still, in many different ways and different forms, it still matters. So I think that is what we think about when we put the lineup together. And I'd like to think that is also, yeah, I do feel a certain kinship with other festivals that also uh, don't have competitions, don't stress world premieres necessarily. And what's important there is just like the overall picture that emerges from the program.
You mentioned something which I think it's extremely important, and it has a counterpart because New York Film Festival doesn't have a market, as you have said, but it doesn't have also a lab or something connected with, because it's a whole stretch of a way of manufacturing cinema, which is competitions, labs, and then the industry, and this whole package, I think, is a little bit uh, complicated for keep cinema not alive. It would be alive, but free, in a way.
Free. Mhm.
So, and this is makes me ask you something. I will use this category now and then, maybe when we'll be talking about Sang-soo and David Lynch. We can see also, or we can think, we can um, take Mr. Manny Farber's famous concepts about white elephant cinema, and
Mhm.
on the other hand, termite cinema. In
Mhm.
terms of festivals, there are termite festivals and white elephant festivals, so to speak.
Mhm.
And I feel like, in a very intelligent way, the New York Film Festival work on both ways, on both paths, so to speak. So because sometimes you have celebrated and consecrated filmmakers, but on the other hand, there are always places for smaller ones. Can you
Mhm.
tell me a little bit about these dialectics between the known and the unknown?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Farber and that specific, dialectic, which I think remains, many decades after he wrote that, still a very useful one, because I think the question of scale and size is always important in cinema. I mean, cinema is, it's an industrial art. So you always think about like relative size of films, and because it's also like a commercial art. There's so much money in it. So I think this question of what's big and what's small and how they work together is an important one. It's also an important one from the more very like, cold practical way of like thinking of finances, of like the money, the economic system of a film festival. Look, I think what we try to do is to provide a lineup that is balanced, that represents different ideas of cinema. Um, as you point out, sometimes drawing from the white elephant side and sometimes from the termite side. But I think overall, in the hopes of making the case that many ideas of cinema are possible, right? So I it's always been important for me to represent independent cinema, to represent experimental cinema. I mean, the festival has historically been about international cinema. It's not. It's American cinema is a big part of it. We are an American festival, a New York festival, and I think we try to reflect that in certain respects. But the entire like DNA of the festival is really about like cinema as a global, contemporary something that is global, looking beyond like just this uh, if you look at Amos Vogel's interest and Richard Raub's interest, and then after that, Richard Pena, and Kent Jones, all of whom had done the job before me, I think that that's also, accurate and representative of their interests and their ideas of cinema. But yeah, I think this sense that we can provide a lineup that is diverse but coherent, that represents a point of view. You don't have to love everything in it. I mean, I will actually just openly say I don't love everything that we show, but like that's not the point. The point isn't my personal taste being reflected. It's just about like, how do I and my colleagues make sense of this big world of cinema that we're in, whether it's like big studio movies that we do show, but also films that by, and also by like, these established like auteurs who are in the pantheon, and also taking a chance on filmmakers that are likely going to be unknown to the festival audience. And I think the festival is really the best opportunity for that. I mean, like, people come to a festival, and I think you have to take advantage of the fact that they are there, hopefully, in a spirit of openness, that there's something that, they may be drawn by what they know. But in my experience, a lot of people go to the festivals and are also, in addition to that, open to what they don't know. So I think this is, the unknown, as you put it, like I think stands, this if you don't introduce them at festivals, where else do you do that? This is the opportunity. I think for us, it's kind of our job, I think, to make sure that we use this platform to show the work that needs it, the work that we believe in.
Dennis, you have said something which is, I think, extremely important. When you do a festival, I work in at this moment in five, so from
Yes.
different positions. I am just a programmer. Sometimes I don't have the last word. Then I do two film festival, which I am the only one selecting
Mm,
and putting my face in front of the audience to say this is what I have selected. But even when I am alone, it's not just a question of taste. There is a question of understanding what is going on in the moving image history and present, because it's quite clear that the cinema is a form which is almost and always in a sense of mutation, in a kind of mutation. So I have to ask myself, what does it mean cinema now, not only in the past, and also to make the connection with the past at the same time. But before asking you something in connected with present and past and the mutation moving image nowadays, from the analogical to the digital and the maybe artificial intelligence, it is a big problem even for cinema. But beyond that, and after that we are about to talk, you said that you were with a selected committee.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, uh, but you are the artistic director.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work on terms of different perspectives, taste, and even beyond taste from those perspectives? Because there could be people who maybe they don't like certain film, but they realize this is important that we have it because we have to provide audiences this kind of film because it says something about cinema nowadays. But on one hand, working with a team, but at the same time, you have the final responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you have the final word or not. How do you work in that particularly dynamic? Because for certain festivals, it's a little bit difficult that
Yeah.
there are a lot of pre-selected committee people working in order that first then they find a couple of films, then the programmers see those films, and then the artistic director is also working, and then the artistic director is not only selecting films, sometimes you have to talk with other people or the media of
Yep.
the culture, blah blah blah. So you know the whole story. How is exactly, how do you see, how do you perceive the you in sense of or your practices as an artistic director?
Yeah, I think it's very delicate. And I should say that, we have not that many, but a few different sections of the festival that have different or overlapping committee members. I'm involved in each one. I think people might disagree with me on this, but I feel like who you work with is important. I do think that I need to work with people, not who I agree with on everything, but there has to be a kind of a broad alignment on. They have to understand, I think, we have to have like a similar idea of like of cinema. I think I just don't see myself working with people where it's like completely oppositional. But I know that some people would say that that's useful. I personally don't think that that's productive necessarily. I disagree a lot with my colleagues on specific films, on specific choices that filmmakers make here and there, but I think we generally agree. Um, I think there's a general idea of we're speaking the same language, and I think we also understand the context of the festival, which is like the history of the festival, its mission, its place, how what it has always been, but also how it needs to evolve to respond to the contemporary landscape. I think a lot of decisions emerge through conversations. I think this idea of having like, when people say something is done by committee, it often has like a negative connotation because it suggests that like nobody owns it and it's just like some, collective decision that is like diluted or watered down and I
Mhm.
feel like yeah, I tend to give more we try when been putting the lineup together. I don't really believe in like voting and then like seeing like which films are the least offensive to the most number of people and then you just end up with like a very kind of inoffensive, bland, like middle of the road kind of lineup. I'm more interested in having if somebody, if I or somebody else has a particularly strong position on a film on like why they think is a film that's important to show, and other people dislike it, I'm more likely to show that film than to show a film that, like, let's say all five of us think is okay. So, I think this question of like conversation is important. Sometimes there's no conversation at all, and we all unanimously agree that this film absolutely must be shown or absolutely cannot be shown. And then there's this, and then I think this it's a useful exercise. I think it's really interesting for me, this process of working with people who I don't agree with on everything, but whose ideas about cinema I respect, and who I know a lot, and also have different preferences from me. So there's no one answer to that. I feel like as the artistic director, I sort of have to accept, ownership and responsibility of the selection. But this process of conversation is really important. I think, especially because, you know, again, it's like I think my answer to your first question, we're always trying to like create this overall picture of cinema now, cinema this year, and what does that picture need? And I think I want to hear what other people think, because it's not just my idea of like of the present landscape.
Yeah, because at the end, the film programmer is a kind of montage. Instead of shots, are
Hmm.
films, and that is the identity of the festival at the end. But it's so difficult, and I can imagine that your position, it's like a film director in a way, like you
Hmm.
know. Maybe the one who is behind the camera has certain idea. So, oh yes, fantastic! You incorporate it, and that's it's a very difficult process to program. Uh,
Yeah, I think related to that, it's like, like what we were saying earlier, it's you have to understand that a festival has many constituents, right? It has many different types of audience. I don't believe in like, when people talk about the audience as like this monolith, there is no
yeah,
audience. There's like different people who
absolutely.
who who are potential audience members. But how do you speak to as many of them as possible without being just, how do you cater to many audiences without losing your point of view, without losing your identity? I think is something we think about too.
Talking about audiences or talking about people who become audiences, one part which is extremely important, and I see not many festivals take advantage of that possibility, is how a catalog is being presented, how you or whoever is behind write on the films, not just the synopsis, but something else, plus the presentation of the films before and after.
Mhm.
After, if there is the filmmaker or someone else from the team, and there will be a conversation or a Q&A. So can you tell me a little bit, how do you perceive these relations between the written words behind before the film is being shown and known
Mhm.
and presented in a catalog or in a magazine? Nowadays, you don't have more film comment in paper, so that is
Yeah.
something which I think is a damaging for the whole. But beyond that, you have the website, of course, but also the importance of introducing films and the importance of, if there is a dialogue, to produce something through the dialogue. And for me, one of the extraordinary things that I've seen and been able to see from you is how you conduct interviews in New York Film Festival. Could you tell us a little bit about
Mhm.
this whole situation, the plus, which is not just showing films?
Yeah. No, I think everything you're talking about is the work of programming, right? It's not just the selection of the film, but it's like everything that surrounds it is the context. I will say that it is a little painful for me that we don't have printed materials, that we don't have the opportunity really to create like texts, which I know that other festivals do, and I think also of like, these great publications that the Biennale has been
Yeah, it's
doing.
true.
And that to me is like a big lack, and I think that's something that I think we miss. It's good that Film Comment is still part of our organization, Film at Lincoln Center, and they still do, quite active publications, even though it's online these days. So we rely on our colleagues there, and I will say that they have total independence to say what they want about the films, to assign whatever writers about the films. So that's helpful. But the other part that you mentioned, I think is really critical, this question of like how a film is presented, just in that physical space of the festival is important. I think we think a lot about who does a screening. Usually I know like which of my colleagues has a particular affinity with a film or a filmmaker. Um, I don't like to say too much about a film before people see it, but I also feel like setting the tone is important, of some kind of expectations. And I do think that that Q&A moment at the end is important, partly because, one of the things that we do is we make sure they're recorded and they're circulated. And they do have a really wide reach. I mean, even in our biggest house, you have 1,000 people watching the film, but if there's a Q&A with, I don't know, David Cronenberg or Mike Lee or somebody, like that circulates quite widely. I think we have a marketing department that's very active and sees that as part of the work of the festival, which I appreciate. I think for me, it's just this question of like not of getting out of the way. I don't, I think people have different moderating styles. I don't think it's ever really about like me. It's about the
Hmm.
the people who have just seen the film and the person who made the film. And I think our work of programming is really about like what is that connection? What would they want to know that would help them, I think, really, understand not necessarily the intent of the filmmaker or anything quite so simple as that, but like what would enhance their experience, their understanding of this film, and I think just trying to get into that headspace. And it's really, to me, it's fairly obvious. It's like, what would I want to know? And I think this is one reason why, you know, I mean, I don't want to, make overly great claims about like you go to other festivals, like, you go to big festivals like Cannes and Venice, and of course there's like a ton of press and a ton of like, reviews and tweets, and press conferences get recorded and circulated and everything. And then, but the screening, and then the screening itself, like people are timing the standing ovations, whether it's like 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. But I think that really, that simple clarity of like just what a filmmaker has to say, I don't think that emerges so easily in those kinds of festivals, because our presentation is more stripped back. It can feel more intimate. And I think a lot of films get lost in that kind of like festival atmosphere. I think of, I think one of my favorite films of last year was the Cronenberg film, The Shrouds, and I thought that film got completely lost in Cannes. I don't think reviewers were really able or willing to process it in that kind of, rhythm of Cannes. Um, but we had incredible screenings. We had short Q&As with Cronenberg, 15-minute Q&As, but he was incredible, lucid, funny. People got the film. I think what he said helped people understand the film. So I do think this is a big part of programming, is like figuring out how to create that context so that the film that you believe in really has the best opportunity of like being, appreciated by a wider audience.
Yeah, tell him it's important. I feel like Cronenberg's, and also to have Cronenberg with the audience. Cronenberg is maybe is one of the most precise filmmaker talking
Hmm.
about what he does.
Yep.
So if you have someone who is capable of asking the proper questions, he could say things that would really open up a perspective of a film like this, which is quite complex, by the way.
Yeah,
And that is the
absolutely.
reason. That is the reason I think in Cannes people didn't know what to think, when to write. It's
Yeah, I agree.
yeah. Uh, yeah, but this is something that I really enjoy when when the website or mainly the YouTube from Lincoln Center puts them availability, the interviews. I usually paid attention on this when you're there because I feel you make the proper job to to enhance through questions the expectation from the viewers and maybe the inner knowledge from the filmmaker. In that sense, we have an old I would say paradigm or yes, a platonic idea, so to speak, of what could be an interview, which is Truffaut with
Yeah,
Hitchcock, which is it's film criticism by other means to do an important interview, and I think you do that, and that is something that I wanted to say openly here
I
because
appreciate that. Thank you.
truly, I really love it. By the way, there is in Argentina there is a magazine called Revista de Cine. They have published the interview you did with Sang-soo, and there you realize immediately, like how it works. Anyway, I like to. How do you perceive now the how you perceive the world of film festivals, which is extremely huge. It's very difficult to encompass in a particular view. There is a kind of pluralistic environment of what it means nowadays. What are film festivals? But I would like to listen to you because you travel around. I have seen you in Biennale. I have seen you, of course, in Cannes and in Berlinale, but also you have visited small film festivals. I remember when
Mhm.
Fikunan began, you were
Yeah.
part of the jury. So how do you see the festivals around?
Oh, it's a big question.
Yeah, no,
Um, I think I I don't really know where to begin. I also feel like I'm not, necessarily the best person to weigh in on other festivals. I think I can speak to our position and what we do, but I do think that festivals, at least how I observe it, like it's so hard to compare them. It's just so hard to compare the Cannes and Venices, even with us or like with a festival, like you said, like Fikunam or anything. I feel like everybody has a different place in the landscape, and I think the ones that succeed, I think, are the ones that should understand their place, in the ecosystem. Right. I mean, in the American context, I mean, and certainly in the New York context, it seems that festivals are popular. We've had like very popular editions the last few years. And I think the question is just like whether that translates to this idea of cinema going as an activity that happens outside of the festival context, instead of like can do people and I think in New York, I will say that in the 30 years that I've lived and worked in New York, this is the one of the most exciting moments for film exhibition and film going. I think I look at the cinemas around town, I look at what people are doing, I look at the people who go there, and I go to these, and I think there is actually, I don't think it is in a bad place. I think there's obviously, you can always find issues, but like it is as healthy as I've ever seen it, just in terms of the variety of films that are shown, the diversity of the audiences who are going. But I know that that's not the case in other places. So, I would hate. I think it's hard. I would hate to generalize. Um, Festivals. I don't know. I think the way festivals work with the industry is a big question. The studios. I think I'm very cognizant of this being a mutually kind of like opportunistic relationship. We use them and they use us. And I think we have to be kind of like open about that, you know?
absolutely.
And I think maybe, yeah, like, and that's just sort of the realities of the world. And I think it is maybe harder and harder for smaller festivals in this larger landscape, but I don't know. I think it's a little bit hard to generalize. I think it varies based on the size of the festival, based on where the festival is situated, based on their audience, based on their source of funding. I mean, there's just so many variables. I mean,
Dennis,
what do
there
you
is
think? I mean, I'm curious. I mean, you work for more festivals than I do, and you definitely
I
go
know,
to
no, but
as
this
many.
time, this time is some, I would rather stress on your words. One day we
Yeah.
talk, I
Okay.
promise. Or maybe
Okay.
I interview myself in a crazy way when I invent something. But just to tell you, I think you are right. Is the generalize is not the proper way, but we can at least focus on certain trends and certain manners. One you've
Mm-hmm.
said the relationship between industry and festival and the opportunistic bond between them that is quite obvious in big festivals, not
Yep.
mainly strictly in New York Film Festival, but in other biggest, like could be especially Cannes, you could really understand that something is going on in those towns that you don't see
Mm-hmm.
behind the
Mm-hmm.
curtains. Maybe there are pressures and you know. But I would like to ask you: there is any film festival, small, big, medium, that you truly follow what they do and you like, or you see, okay, these people, this festival is doing something which makes a difference in the ecology? Because the problem, what I see, and this is not a
Mm-hmm.
generalizing point, is there seems to be like three, four big festivals, especially Cannes, and they organize the agenda, they organize the priorities in a way. And then you see a lot of small or medium film festivals which they more or less reproduce what they legitimize in a way. And after
Mm-hmm.
that, they just add the color of the country. Okay, they have the Argentinian selection, the Mexican selection, the Peruvian selection, the Singaporean selection. But as a bunch of films, you always have the feeling like there are around 100 and 550 films which goes around the whole world. But what I see, and this is something that it matters to me, how many films which are extremely extraordinary and extremely different, they do not get a place in this ecosystem. That is something that for me, it's important. But maybe because I
Mm-hmm.
know that you travel around, have you
Mm-hmm.
ever found a place and say, okay, these people is doing this or doing that, or maybe biggest? I don't know. I like to listen to you.
Yeah, I think you know, actually I'm traveling a bit less these days than I used to, but I can only just go on like what I see on paper, you know, like the programs sometimes. I'm not saying this just because I'm talking to you, but I do, no, I do feel a real kind of kinship with the Biennale. I do think that like I like the idea that there's no
Competition.
yeah, the way that like, you know, there is a proposition there that's clear. It's not about, you know, and I think that there has been a continuity throughout the history of that festival that I really
Yeah. I'm so
admire, you
I'm
know.
so happy that you said that, the continuation
Uh
between Hans and Evers, because
yeah,
it's
I
something
think
that I care
it's
about it.
but I do think that, you know, different festivals do different. I mean, I mean, we, you know, I think what your point is about can setting the agenda is undeniable. I mean, like, you know, everybody tries to go there, and if they don't go there, they go to Venice or Berlin, and then, you know, and then everything else falls into place based on like one. And I think it's been this way for a while now, right? So, um, I think, look, I just also want to point, like, you know, I said we don't have a real emphasis on world premieres, you know, but we did have three world premieres last year that I just wanted to, you know, just note because it was for me interesting that these films did not find another festival
Right.
to world
Yeah.
premiere at. And these are films by three American filmmakers who are not new, who've been working for decades. Julia Lockdev, uh, Jem Cohen, and Robinson DeVore. And to me, these are like interesting, you know, some of the most interesting American filmmakers there are, certainly of their generation. And I know that I mean, I know that other festivals saw the films, but for whatever reason found them too challenging or too small or too this or that, But I think, and I can only say this in, in just I'm happy to serve that purpose of like giving these,
Yeah, yeah.
these of being a platform for these films. And then I see that these films go on to like actually have a presence. I know Julia's film went to the Berlinale, and then like she has done screenings at Cinema de Real, and then Jem's film was just at Vision de Real. And I think there's like, and I think those smaller festivals that I just mentioned too, I do think they are interesting because they have a place. They have a place. They have an identity. And I think they understand their context and they understand their audience.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think this opportunity of just there's a film I showed last year that I think wasn't even submitted to us, but I noticed it on like Feed Marseille's lineup, which is Seven Walks with Mark Brown, a film by Pierre Casson,
Outstanding
but
film. One of, for me, it's
extraordinary film, I
extraordinary.
think. Yeah,
Extraordinary.
and yeah, one of my favorite films of the year too. But like they didn't even submit it to us because they thought it would be like too small for the New York Film Festival. So I think just to be on the lookout for these things. I don't um I think there's a lot of really good, interesting, hardworking programmers out there, like friends of ours that we know, and I think they're really trying to do their what they can in their their context. But sometimes they are the people running the events, and sometimes there are people who are like more like playing smaller roles, but trying to do their part. But like it's hard. I don't know if I would point to like a festival that is has figured out a way to uh, thrive. I guess in the current climate, it's just tricky, it's tricky. The sort of the power dynamics are so entrenched, are so set, in place that as you say, like the big festivals set the agenda for everybody else, and I think that's just maybe something we just I know that I acknowledge that, and I work with it. I think Cannes takes a lot of big films, sometimes a lot of great films, and I want to show them. But I also want to look for films that
Yeah.
fall through that would never ever have a chance of showing there. I think it's important
My,
to find those films.
my feeling is like when I began working in this world that we are in, I think it was well, first my personal history is I began as a cineclubist
Mm,
programmer in the middle of the mountain, programming films, doing my own myself the subtitles and so on. Doesn't matter. But when I began working for a film festival was around 20 years ago, and since then I have never stopped. When I began, I had the feeling that there were more space for certain kind of cinema. For instance, I cannot imagine
mm,
how difficult it would be nowadays if a film like Mystery Object at
mm-hmm,
midnight will be as a new film. I wonder myself if that film would be easily being absorbed by a film festival nowadays. What I mean is, in the past, in the last, at the end of the century, beginning of this one, I had the feeling that there was more openness towards certain kind of mutation in narratives and in certain kind of films that nowadays is shrinking that a little bit. I don't know
mm,
exactly what are the causes of it, but I had the impression of that
mm,
because I see a lot of films rejected, like the one that you said before. So I was wondering, the last thing that I saw, which was an opportunity in terms of big festivals, was Encounters in Berlinale,
mm-hmm,
which
mm-hmm,
I think was the greatest creation for me for a festival. It didn't work for the Germans, maybe, but it worked for the cinephile culture, I think. There were extraordinary films being shown there. And I don't see, sections like that anymore. It's
mm-hmm.
I don't know, how do you perceive this?
I think I agree. I think but I mean, so your argument is that you think these films are being made still, but they are
Yeah,
just not finding the platform. So you think they
yeah,
still
yeah.
exist. It's the question. You're not making the claim that there are fewer interesting films or fewer adventurous films,
No, I don't.
because I think yeah.
I don't think there are less. I think maybe
Mm-hmm.
there are more, but there are
Mm-hmm.
more films in general.
Yeah.
Maybe there are more films like that, but they are not in the system. I don't know how to.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that there is this sense that for a certain kind of filmmaker, that these spaces are shrinking, right? Like that you mentioned, encounters, which I think is obviously I think a very bold initiative for a festival of that stature. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be I look at certain sections of certain festivals and I feel like they could maybe have a different
Yeah,
mandate. I mean, I don't want to
yeah,
be
yeah,
too I think you know what I mean.
yeah,
But
yeah.
like
Absolutely, absolutely.
but I think it's by choice that they, but I think, things come and go and the festival landscape is as much in flux as everything else, yeah, I'm glad, for instance, at a festival that, like I'm glad the filmmaker like Radu Judah still, shows in competition in Berlinale and still shows in competition in Locarno, even though I think, it seems that he will that these films are maybe not for Cannes in the current configuration of things. But I think there's still opportunities. Are there fewer
But
spaces? Maybe.
Brother Judas case is an extraordinary paradigm to think of, because if you ask me which is the film which express in a much extraordinary and interesting way where are we in terms of film
Hmm.
world images and so on, that was Do Not Expect So Much at the End of the
Yeah.
World, and that film was rejected by Cannes.
Yes.
So for me, one of the biggest mistakes they ever done, also with Sama. But
Hmm.
that is interesting because it's so obvious for me when you see, especially Radu's film, that there is something so from nowadays in that film, particularly that one.
Hmm.
And they
Hmm.
say, how could it be that they don't take it? I'm not criticizing Kant. That's not a problem. I'm think how if you cannot recognize that, I wonder myself how many films are like that. Maybe not many, but some, which we don't have the eyes to recognize them when they are in
Hmm.
front of our eyes. That is my problem as a programmer, in fact.
I totally hear that, but I would also say that, a lot of people did recognize that
Yes,
film
it's true.
is
Absolutely, absolutely.
important, and I feel like that film that maybe shows that you don't need a Cannes platform. You can go to Locarno and win a prize, and people like you and me will show this film, and a lot of intelligent critics will respond to it, and I feel like that film has generated a discourse that did not need. Obviously, it would be nice. I feel like I do think if I do think a film like that obviously does deserve a platform like Cannes, but if Cannes disagrees, it's out of our hands, I would say.
Absolutely, you're right. Let me go from film festivals towards the two books you wrote,
Okay.
which is there are interesting objects. As books are fantastic for me, both of them. But the interesting thing for me is the differences of the authors in a way. Another way are not.
Mm, mm,
On
mm,
one hand, Lynch maybe is the most complex American filmmaker in the last 20, 25 years. People do not know exactly what to think about the films. And as you said, there is epimon, there is the Lynchian thing, like Kafka.
mm,
Most of the time
mhm,
doesn't happen with how a surname becomes an adjective. That's a
mm,
very strange movement in the culture in general terms. So on one hand, we have this filmmaker who has worked with big stars. We has a lot of production value, not in all, but most of his films. You know, you feel there is an industry, but at the same time, it's amazing that he was able to work on in the industry in a way. And on the other hand, we have this particular case, which is Hong Sang-soo, which in a moment when he began, maybe there was more things behind the film, there was more value, production value, but it is quite clear that since Tale of Cinema changed completely that, or radicalized on something small, simpler in a way. Again, I don't consider simple at all. And so it seems to be two options that you have taken which express the antipodes, you know, like from one side, the complex, in many sense of the world, and on the other hand, the simplest. Can you tell me a little bit about this movement in your head between Lynch and Hong?
Yeah, no, that's very, it's interesting. First of all, I should say that, you know, the books originated not necessarily as my ideas. I mean, I had written about both filmmakers, but in both cases, I was approached and asked if I was interested in writing about Lynch and then in writing about Hong. And I think in both, you know, both cases, I said yes immediately because um, I don't think I'm the kind of writer who necessarily knows like what I think about something until I write it. And you know, I don't feel I think a lot of people, a lot of cinephiles, a lot of programmers, I think feel very decisive. And I don't. I'm actually okay like being in a state of uncertainty or ambiguity of not really knowing if I, you know, how I feel about something. And Lynch and Hong were filmmakers I responded to a lot, but I did not really have the language, I think, to explain why until after I wrote the books. So I think the process was a way of figuring out. For me, even though I think you're right about this, you know, that they seem very different on the surface, there's a complexity of affect in terms of how I found the films challenging to process, even though I loved them. And that for me was always a great starting point for writing about something, you know, something that has a complexity that I'm trying to work with, and maybe not even necessarily coming up with a solution. You know, I think I'm more interested in writing that is like maybe propositional or like, you know, that tries out different lenses, different frameworks, and different ways of understanding someone instead of having a very clear thesis. I don't know that I have a super clear thesis on either one of them. I was just in both cases, I think, trying the same thing, just trying to understand how these films work and why they produce the complex reaction in me and in so many others. I will say though that I think now that I think about it, there's a similarity between the two of them, which is just their refusal or like their inability or their difficulty of being assimilated in a system. You know, and I think Lynch was a filmmaker who obviously worked in Hollywood for much of his career, even worked in like network television, you know, but this lot the famous stories about like how those things didn't go very well. And I think how he managed to retain his very idiosyncratic, very distinctive voice, personality in these works that are made for studios, made for television, made for forms that are supposed to flatten you know, uh, I think that is interesting, and I think the reason he worked so little, relatively, if you know think of how many films he made in his life, not that many. He made 10 feature films, you know.
Exactly.
So I think that was also because of his how he could not really be absorbed by the system. I mean, he resisted it, the system resisted it. It was mutual. There was a rejection there, and Hong, I think consciously rejected the system. He made his own system. He like you know he cannot work in this form of feature film production that requires you to write a script and then to find money and then to wait and then you know I think he totally rejected that system and found a language that fits the you know the economics, you know, and I think that's the great genius of the work. The project is how if the system doesn't work for you, what can you do? And in Hong's case, it's just like I'll make my own system. And I think
Mhm.
that's like that's something that I'm not saying that all filmmakers need to watch his films or need to like them, but like that's a lesson. I mean, that's a really hugely, I think instructive way to think about cinema, which of course is a complicated, collaborative, expensive art form. But Hong shows you can do it. You can do one form of it by with not a lot of money and with like almost no people. He can. So I think that is what they have in common for me, and I think what draws me to them, this idea that they recognize that the system of film production is broken, and they don't want to participate in it. And I think that actually creates the tension, and that also like leads them to work in very particular ways that I find interesting.
In the case of Lynch in the book, you work in a kind of systematically way, like from the beginning to the end.
Mm.
There is an introduction, which is an important introduction. It's not just an introduction. It gives you an idea of Lynch work and how you will be approached towards it. But one of the interesting thing about Lynch, it is his films. It's quite clearly that we don't exactly know what they mean. It is quite
Hmm.
also clearly that people wants to make them to say this or that. That is the reason
Yeah,
that are like the Jungian psychologist,
yeah.
film critic orientated talking about him, or Lacanians. So you have
Hmm.
such an opposite
Hmm.
approach towards those films.
Yeah.
But you, in a way, you have done something that I found it much more interested, which is this compose the films how they work beyond what they mean. I
Hmm.
don't know if you agree with this. And what do you think? What is the importance of understanding how an opera or a couple of
Hmm.
films or a film works as such in order to
Mm.
get access from another point to understand what it is?
Yeah, I think I read a lot of the interpretations of Lynch, before writing the book, and like very heavy on, yeah, Lacan and Jung and all this very obvious stuff. But I didn't find it really useful. I didn't find it really representative of my experience with these films. I think I'm more interested. Yeah, I think maybe that's a good way of putting it. Like what are the films doing? I think is sort of more interesting than like what do they mean? And I think it's a slightly different question. I think some people probably find the approach frustrating that I don't definitively say this film means that, and but I don't think I've ever really. It just doesn't work for me as like a way of at least for these filmmakers. I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's interesting. I think it's very reductive to say that yeah, the films are about this thing, I yeah, I think because there's so much going on in the films. There's so many interesting choices. Why not look at that? Why not work with that instead of like, and I think it's fine. I don't have anything against some of, using psychoanalytic theory or whatever, but like it's just not my area of like I think it's not I don't come from that way of interpreting necessarily. And I think it's that's kind of the beauty of Lynch in a way. I think he lends himself to a lot of different lenses.
But that is also something interesting in comparison with Mr. David Cronenberg, and
Mm,
maybe Hong is in the middle. Uh, when you listen to Mr. Cronenberg, there is a kind of extreme line between what you see and what he says.
hmm.
But when you see a Lynch film, what Mr. David Lynch used to say about his films are not exactly a linear,
No.
a straight line towards the film. It's a possibility, of course. It's someone who is
Hmm.
nearby, but it seems
Hmm.
to be that the films are much more complex from what he used to believe or say or
Mm,
explain, which in a
absolutely.
way in which I will explain, you at the beginning of the book, you put the anecdote when he went to the psychoanalyst or
Yeah,
psychologist,
yeah,
and they say, okay, can stop my flow of creativity? And they say yes. So he never came back. It was very
yeah.
fun.
No,
So,
I also
but
think this is the other thing that I think that Lynch and Hong have in common. It's just like the way they talk about their films is like very, it's the idea that they would ever be, in a position to interpret their films is like unthinkable to them. They would never, ever interpret their films. And I find that interesting too. Lynch had a very particular, I think besides the work itself, he also had a public persona, which I think is part it's a little bit cultivated, but it's also it's who he is, who he became, and not talking or not saying anything too clear was part of that persona, and I think as people age, I think they become their persona, and I
absolutely.
think that was the case. And Hong, I think, has this reputation of being somebody who's very like tight-lipped. He doesn't say much, but and you were talking about like, interviewing Hong, which I've done several times now. And I think it's a matter of this to come back to what you were talking about interviewing them. It's like figuring out, and sometimes you can do this based on like seeing past interviews, your past experiences with that person, reading, what articles and so on. It's like getting a sense of what they want to talk about and what is interesting. And Hong, I find, is very interesting when he talks about process, extremely interesting. But if you ask him like why is this film in two parts and why is that film in three parts? It's like a ridiculous question for him. Why the why is like completely not an answerable question. Not But if you ask him like how many days did you take, like that, how did you find that location? Like just the very concrete things. I think leads you to understand the films in particular ways, and that's not true of all filmmakers. Some people like to philosophize and but I think understanding what you can get from someone is maybe part of the skill, I guess.
I would like to go a little bit more, if you have time,
Yeah,
not so
of course.
many more minutes, but to speak a little bit about Hong. And then when we finish talking about Hong, I have just a last question, which is personal, but you will see.
Okay. Okay.
Is how to earn $1 million per month. No, no, that's not the truth. No, about Hong is it's the following. It's something that I learned listening to you and reading you is that one of the important books in his youth times was Notes from on the Cinematographer by Bresson,
Hmm.
and particularly he used to love Diary of a rural priest.
Hmm.
And when we think on those films and Hong, it seems to be far detached. It could be also a kind of a far detached assumption to say, a far-fetched assumption
Hmm.
to say they are together in a way. But when you began thinking on both, well, yes, especially about the idea of the just to work with what is necessary. When you
Yeah.
see a Hong Sang-soo film, it's very difficult to find any sequence or shot even that you say this is not necessary. You feel that there is one after another seems to be a need from
Hmm.
the shot behind and the coming after. So I like to know if you have more ideas on that relationship because it's for me it's a very productive way of thinking because you never imagine together.
Yeah. I think maybe watching the films, they can seem a bit far apart. Certainly thematically, they're quite different, and you could say. Although I don't know, I think Hong has had, I think maybe recently, a little bit more of a spiritual side to his cinema. But I think you really, really, for me, see the kinship when you read notes again, and you really get the sense of a filmmaker willing to not just thinking about film language, but willing to rethink film language. the idea that film language is something you can break apart and play with, and you can rethink like the absolute, like how do you use sound, and like, just like this is very basic ideas, fundamental ideas. And I think Hong has been willing to do that too in his cinema. I think this idea of uh working with what is available to you is really very key. But also there's a certain interesting connection between concreteness and the material, and also like abstraction and thought, and how you can, use the concrete as a way to get to the abstract, that I think is relevant for both of them. Um, Yeah, I think Bresson in a way is if for anybody trying to understand Hong's cinema, just reading like a few pages of notes, I think you get a very clear idea of like how of his philosophy of cinema. It's quite close.
Mhm. Yeah, I also have that feeling, and but that was something that I learned from you. Huh? I've never did the connection, and when I read about it, I said, okay, that is something, and he's right. I think there is something to explore for that. How do you feel, or how do you perceive there is something extremely specific in Hong, which is that each shot it seems to be justified by its existence. The film could be beginning in this shot and ending in the end of the shot, and you will have a film. Like I've had the feeling that he has invented a way of making a microscopic narrative which
Hmm.
do not go towards a teleology. It doesn't go towards the end.
Mm,
If not, in each moment there is something adding, but it not goes towards the end like a line which is going up. On the contrary,
hmm.
there's always an
It's
intensity. How do you perceive this?
Yeah, but you mean like the moments are contained somehow, like they did
In
yeah,
itself, it's justified
in
in
itself.
itself, but the films is being worked in this way. Like there is no act. It is each shot, each sequence has a certain meaning in itself. It works in itself, and all together
Hmm.
makes a fantastic film. That's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. That's kind of the mystery, right? Of the films. I think I
It
do,
is a
I do,
mystery.
I
It
do
is.
think, I do think the process is part of it. When you, as you know, if like Hong, you don't have a plan going in. You don't have a script. You don't. There's no this idea of the teleological progression. He
Yeah,
doesn't have
absolutely.
one. He doesn't know. So that's why you don't feel it. Um, and I think his way of working, besides being minimal and frugal, also forces him to be in the present, kind of in the moment, as he's writing, as he's shooting. And I think that creates the effect that you're describing. Yeah, so I think what you're describing is one of the mysteries of his work. But it also makes sense when you think about his process, right? Because there's no sense of like teleological progress, because he doesn't know where the film is going based on how he works, right? He writes the scene, he shoots it, he writes every day, and he only knows what is happening that day. So there is something about the way he writes and the way he shoots that forces him, and I think forces everyone else, the actors too, to be in that moment, in the present. And I think that might be what gives those moments the kind of fullness that you described. It's a certain kind of attentiveness and alertness that I think is impossible any other way. And I think the process explains it.
That is very interesting. And again,
Yeah,
explaining the process makes an
yeah,
idea how to approach it. And it's a very good,
yeah.
it goes around with the other answer that you did before, that you gave me before. Um, just to be ending,
Yeah.
uh, this is a small question. I had been trying to, when I see a home film, I count the shots, I count, I count the zooms, I count the camera movement, and I have tried to rationalize what is going on with the zoom changing framing in the main shot. That's
Mm-hmm.
what the zoom does. Most of the time, I don't know how you perceive that. I think there is a change in the quality of the conversation. It doesn't mean that what it's about to be said is extremely important, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like a changing mood. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
try to. Did you have any other answer to that?
I think that he, tries to use it in different ways. I think he also, if you hear him talk about how he works, and now he doesn't work with the DP. I mean, like when he used to work with the
Yeah,
DP, he would just
yeah,
like he would stand behind the DP and like signal, like just tap him on the shoulder to zoom, And so it's very much a way of I think it's a way of responding to the scene. It's a way of like annotating the scene as it happens. And I use this quote in the book, I think. There's a quote by Eric Romer that I really like when he describes the zoom as the point of view of somebody who is taking part. So this idea that there's somebody taking part, witnessing, that there is a person, a gaze, a human gaze
yeah.
that is, and not just a camera one. Um, but yeah, I think there's sometimes, but not always, it's suggesting that something has changed,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But it's unclear what that thing is, And I think to me, the zoom is also a way that it's a kind of it's a form that matches the way his characters think, like they're trapped in their own heads and then they pull out and then they look at themselves from the outside. And I think that and there's a certain awkwardness to the zoom, like, especially the way he uses it. And I think the awkwardness is an affect, is a quality that Hong works with a lot too.
And with this is almost over. I just have a small question. How could it be that someone who has studied economics in the London Economics University has become such an extraordinary film critic? How do
I
you change?
I studied mathematics actually, so I
Mathematics,
don't know.
mathematics,
So
sorry.
I
Yeah.
don't know if that makes any more sense, but I I think I started with criticism, but I wasn't exclusively a film critic. I was just more interested in writing as a way to figure out things as a student when I was, an undergraduate. So I think it just and I think this really that's when I think this love of cinema really, I'd always loved it, but like I think writing about it made me think more seriously about it. And then in graduate school, I did study journalism and I took some film classes, so that's when it became more like more solidified. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who work in film who studied all kinds of other
I
other
know.
things. I'd like to keep track of people who come from other spaces, unlikely ones too.
Yes, I know very well that my own experience, but this is the
Yeah.
interview on you, not on me. And I have loved that you have gone from numbers to shots. It has been extremely important for readers, viewers, and I really, really, really thank you so much that that we have been together talking about your work, your passions, and the thing we love. Thank you so much, Dennis, for your time, your kindness, and I hope to read a new book by you on Alain Guiraudy, another passion that we have in common.
Absolutely, absolutely. Maybe not on Garrity, but yeah, no, I'm glad that that's a passion we share. No, thank you, Roger. We could have gone on even longer. I'm sure this was a real pleasure for me.
Thank you so much, my friend. Bye bye.
Thank you. All
Y
right.
sí. Gracias
Okay.
a todos. Nos reencontramos con otros de los encuentros. Viene Marco Susal, Albertina Carri. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Bye.